good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of our conversations in the series on behalf of the Association for Medical Humanities under the theme of futures this time. I want to thank you all for coming. I just want to say a couple of things. The first is that we sold out for this event, and so if you haven't yet got a ticket for next month's, after the end of this you might want to rush and be quick. And I also wanted to say, as you know, we're recording, and that the recording of last month's seminar on loss will be posted up during the next week on the website if you would like to go and have a look at that. For those who are interested in joining or rejoining the association, we've made the process much, much easier. You'll be very glad to know. That's on the website too. And we'd love you to send us your blogs if you'd like something to be published on our site. And then finally, I'd like to draw your attention to our Limerick conference, which will be taking place in June online. We don't have all the details yet, but more will be coming again on the website. So without further ado, with many thanks to our speakers and to Joe Winning and Bridget, who are curating this evening's conversations, I'd like to welcome you and hand over to Joe.
Thank you, Jennifer. And just to second that warm welcome to those of you who are rejoining us tonight for our next conversation in our series, and also to those of you who are joining us for the first time this evening. We're very pleased to have you all here with us. A couple of housekeeping points to start. We ask you to keep your mics off, and Bridget and I will be quite careful to make sure that people's mics are off, so that the conversation isn't interrupted with any background noise. And we'd really invite you to use the chat to put in any thoughts that occur to you, and also to put questions to our speakers, which Bridget and I will bring in once they've talked to each other. So we'll kind of use the chat really as an opportunity for you to participate in the conversation. We will, out of courtesy and kindness and care to our speakers this evening, we will finish promptly at 9 or perhaps slightly before, depending on how the conversation goes. So we're continuing tonight, as Jennifer says, with the theme on futures. As with the theme of loss, which we explored last month in the conversation between Ajay Thachul, a clinician, and Zoe Playden, a humanities scholar, we believe at AMH that medical humanities is uniquely placed to create a space for talking and reflecting across disciplinary boundaries about what we might need for a post-pandemic future, a post-crisis future. In an interview titled Pandemic Times given last November in the magazine Ephemera, my Birkbeck colleague, Professor Lisa Baretza, writes, "One of the things that COVID-19 has revealed is both the temporality of the current moment as one of standby, and the paradoxical need to endure standby, even to open it up in order to take care of time, to produce the careful attention that is required to really know about the injustices of the present in order for there to be a future at all." With the announcement of the government's roadmap out of lockdown on Monday this week, with all its dates and stages, its details and its omissions, here in the UK, we're suddenly all focused again on what the future will look like. When will it start? But we're still, of course, stuck in this place of standby, a place of restrictions, inequalities, and vulnerabilities. In this moment of standby, there is time to ask how the humanities, as well as the sciences, will contribute contribute to envisioning and planning a healthy, equitable future for all. So this evening, we're both deeply grateful and deeply privileged to have two eminent speakers join with us this evening to offer their thoughts to each other and to us on what kinds of futures might be imaginable, perhaps even possible. So now I'd like to welcome Professor Aditi Lahiri, who is Professor of Linguistics at the University of Oxford and Vice President Humanities of the British Academy, and Professor Jane McNaughton, Professor of Medical Humanities at the University of Durham and Director of the Durham Institute of Medical Humanities. No, I think I'm right in saying that we're going to start with Aditi. So I shall hand over to her now.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, Jennifer. This is really a great honor, but I should also add that this is completely out of my comfort zone. And I think I was invited because of the British Academy Vice Presidency and the fact that we produced a document on Shape the Future, essentially talking about the future after the pandemic. But I have to be absolutely honest and say that the work was entirely a huge number of workshops put together. Almost 100 FBAs and other scholars were involved in this. And the document itself, I mean, was largely the product of Molly Morgan-Jones, who's our Director of Policy at the British Academy, and my compatriot in social sciences, Dominic Abrams. So it's really, I usually talk about linguistics, which couldn't be more boring. So here, I'll give it a try and see where we go with this. So the Academy, as the British Academy, was engaged in a wide-ranging consultation, and it was involved in sort of discussing where the humanities and social sciences could play a role in assessing the research and the policy areas which are important during the pandemic and after the pandemic. The SHAPE sort of acronym, I mean, this country is full of acronyms, isn't it? I came to Oxford 13 years ago and I had to deal with acronyms and I wasn't used to this. So the SHAPE acronym was developed almost by accident. It's supposed to be counter to the STEM acronym, and it includes social sciences, humanities, arts for the people, and the environment. It could be the economy, but I think I prefer the environment. So the initiative sought to bring insights from social sciences and humanities and arts. And we held about 20 policy and research workshops. And the main themes were, sort of broadly speaking, revitalizing the societal well-being, recreating an inclusive economy around purpose, and revisiting the histories and cultures of science, policy, and politics. I'm not going to talk much about the economy, but mostly about the humanities aspects of it. And we came up with 5 broad principles, of which I think I'll just touch on 4. The sort of a broad knowledge base in policy making. So put the STEM and the SHAPE together when you're coming up with the policies. Don't forget the historical, the cultural, and the behavioral and aspects together with the medical, biological, and the physical. And be responsive to local and historical context when you're policy making. Consider the implications of voice and political authority, particularly with attention to language and discourse. And finally, the inequalities and inclusivity. So the inequalities, in every workshop we held, the inequality was very much there from all aspects. So I'll touch on a few of the workshops or the topics that we covered, and I try to choose between the ones that we don't normally think about and are not quite obvious. So for example, one of the things that was very important to our historian colleagues was, and myself, was learning from history. So history shows that in extremely stressful circumstances, like war and pandemics, human behavior will frequently derail in very predictable ways. So what can we learn from that? And plagues, pandemics, it's a major feature of history. It's not just here, but all over the world and all through centuries. And we keep forgetting them, and we keep forgetting what has been learned from those, and what we could remember. And if we could have only looked back, face coverings and washing hands were just as common then as it has been now. So that was the history part of it, and I think if you have the document, I'll send the link to. I should have done it now. I send the link to Jo, and she can put it on later. So the next point was information. Where is there too much information? Not just too little, but too much. So immense amounts of information are put out to people, particularly now, given all the kinds of media coverage that we have. The question then it raises, how much information is too much? How should it be conveyed? How should it be presented to the audience? What is the balance of the data and the management of anxiety? while the provision of information is seen as a sign of respect, then the question has been that not everything has been actively published. Should it have been? Who are making these decisions? And these decisions need to be made not just by keeping in mind what the votes are going to be, but what is really necessary and needful and how you want to make that communication. And then, of course, that leads directly to language. So the language in a multilingual, multicultural society, communication also needs to be culturally sensitive and reflect the societal practices of different ethnic groups. So research has shown, for example, international students can grasp the fact that what is, what the requirements are, but often a direct translation, for example, a direct translation of social distancing is very difficult to make, particularly in cultures where some cultures are very by definition, you keep a certain amount of distance, while from where I come from or in Italy, the social distancing would be rather foreign to you. And shaking hands versus joining your hands, things like that do matter when you're communicating. So there is a particular challenge where adults rely on children, for example, for language brokering, because health matters are the most difficult for children to translate. And this happens a lot in this country. So the children simply do not have an understanding of the vocabulary because of their age alongside with the sensitivity of the issues. So health matters are the most difficult for children to translate. And in this pandemic has highlighted several different resource challenges to effective communication and the dissemination of good practice examples. Another point people can tend forgetting is the British Sign Language or sign language in general. Sign language with your mask on or sign language via the computer is rather different from sign language in normal usage between conversations. Then we come next right away to stigma approaches to infectious diseases. So linguistic expressions about diseases carries historical baggage. We all know that. And it can express and exacerbate stigma. So COVID-19 has resurfaced discussions in the media and academia about stigmatized diseases past and present. So the emergence of disease into the countries and subgroups has often accompanied early in the local sort of epidemic, like a blaming discourse. Who is to blame? Yes. Now, I move now into what I think most of us have encountered somehow or the other, is the divide between, on the one hand, young children and the effect of them, and on those of sort of entering higher education. So for the young children, the lack of access to resources, it has been leading to a much bigger divide. So there is an increase in anxiety. The COVID pandemic has led to profound changes in the lives of the young people. It has focused on the medium and longer term impacts in such, in cases of family, community, education, from being a child to becoming an adult. And there have been severe implications for a wide range of children, vulnerable children with special needs, children in family with domestic abuse, for example, children with parents in prison, not being able to visit, but also things like general can be additional strain between parents and siblings during lockdown, and particularly in small spaces. So here the economic status and the effect on children are directly related. So the implications of policy development identified a strong focus on education on vulnerable children. And again, the lack of resources there. So all impacts on young people who are transitioning into the labor market. Okay. So there from that, we move to the higher education, which is a sort of a hobby horse of mine because we deal with this all the time. And that is in a way, three groups, let's say undergraduates who had 3 years left. So those who came in the first year and the second year was the pandemic, they had at least some experience of the first year. Those who came in from their first year of the pandemic, they have had no experience of what a university life would or a college life would be like. And those the final year, the exams have been difficult. The type of exams have changed. It's an enormous impact. And the worst part is people will forget. So again, back to the history, people will forget. It's sort of like, it's no different from the war times when 4 years of their lives have been gone, and people would like to forget because nobody likes to remember what the difficult times, but think of the happy times. but this is going to have an effect long term. But the other type, in higher education, are the postdoctoral fellows. The postdoctoral fellows who are funded for a very short time that is their only time left to do the research on before they can, get a proper job, if they can get a proper job. But there, the funding is never going to be extended. British Academy did extend 6 months, with most of the other fundings are going to say, well, we can give you no cost extensions. Well, you can't not eat and starve and do your work. That's not going to go very far. So for them too, that time is gone. And once it's gone, it's gone. It's not good. It's not retrievable anymore. So following from this effort in the number of workshops and the number of policies that we came up with, for suggestions really for the policymakers, we were also asked by the government chief scientific advisor to produce an independent report with the question, what are the long-term societal effects and impacts of COVID-19? I can't talk about that now because the document is going to be published next month. But one of the things that came across very clearly was that there is not one solution, and you have to keep in mind the several interconnections and interdependencies among the several impacts, and not to forget that the shape and the stem have to come together. So policy must be developed to address all of these and not just some of them. And from my point of view, we are facing not just a few years of COVID. People are talking about a COVID decade, but I think it's going to be a few decades, and the challenges are not just here, but have to be addressed internationally. It's not just a very local problem. So perhaps we want to try to reinforce some of what we have learned and perhaps rectify others, but ensuring that we do not forget the past to improve the future. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Aditi. That was fantastic. I'm going to ask Jane to come in now. And Jane, you may wish to either comment on some of Aditi's points, or you may just want to go on with your own thoughts, and then we'll bring you both together, whatever you feel best.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, some of Aditi's points, I think I'll be kind of touching on in different kinds of ways. I mean, I think some of it's really super to hear that the British Academy have been called upon to produce this report. I went to an interesting meeting about a month ago, which was kind of a debate about whether we need a sage for the arts or a sage for the humanities, and what role would that play? And that made me think very much when I heard about Aditi's and the British Academy's initiative, made me think very, very much about that. The notion of forgetting, I think, will come out in what I have to say as well. I just want to say it's just terrific to see the AMH, which I was very heavily involved in at the outset, and it's great to be here amongst you all again and seeing so many people that I've known, and it's lovely to reconnect with you and see things flourishing so well. It's such an important field for us to be involved in terms of discussions. This is such a big theme, and Aditi has already indicated that we can only really scratch the surface. And I'm going to, again, as Aditi says, I offer no expertise in this field, but just I hope some thoughts that will help to stimulate discussion. I think I wanted to start by just acknowledging that this is really personal, actually, for all of us, and perhaps more so for some of us who've lost somebody, who've suffered from COVID ourselves, or seen the loss of employment, or a sense of hope for the future for yourself or for loved ones. So it's not a subject that we can discuss at arm's length. It's something that is really quite close to all of us in terms of our lived experience. And I mean, just thinking back about Aditi's reflections on the historical, I was thinking about people like my mother, who's now 88, who lived through the Second World War. That's probably the only other kind of really intense experience of change that is akin to what we are now experiencing ourselves. And comparisons have been made with that. The ways in which COVID has this impact on our lives, livelihoods, and relationships. And it's changed many for us, actually. I think those of us living in a stable country like the UK, we've got this shift in our sense of confidence in the future that we've had. As we move into the future, there's a kind of sense of that it's not stable for us in the same way. This sense of kind of ongoing improvement, or at least stability in our living conditions. It's destabilized our sense of continuity, I think, that although climate change has got the potential to do that in the future, it hasn't really impacted upon us in that really severe way. So I think we're living history right now in a way that makes us think differently about it. Historical events often happen at a distance from us, in other countries or in the corridors of power or political power, but not on our doorsteps with these major implications for how we live our lives. And during the pandemic, it seems that what we've anticipated might happen seems to happen very quickly. You know, we're used to change happening slowly and having an impact slowly, whereas, you know, we might suddenly find ourselves facing an announcement in the evening that immediately locks us down or changes our lives the next day. The Christmas party we planned is off. The holiday we were going to go on is dashed. The friends and family we wanted to see, we can't see for months and months on end. All those things that we were hoping to do just suddenly disappear. Now, medical humanities has tended first and foremost to be associated with the ways in which the arts and humanities help us to understand health. But what the COVID pandemic, I think, has revealed above all is what the field of critical medical humanities has always insisted on, is that this deep entanglement of social, cultural, historical life with the biomedical. And what's fascinating about the current crisis, where it's not so devastating, is the fact that we as historians, as cultural commentators, as well as people living it, are watching these elements of our collective lived experience connect and disconnect in real time. It's a bit like watching history and fast forward at the moment. And I think it makes us as academic researchers and commentators wary of saying things about what's going on, because the next day everything might be different. And I think the pandemic really demonstrates quite clearly the meaning of culture, that it's not a static entity. It's produced and evolved over time through interaction and relationship. And I was looking at some of the, Aditi mentioned this notion of sort of anxiety that we have, this experiential and the allied emotional trajectory of the pandemic has taken different shapes across nations and at different times. But there have been some commonalities. I read the digital humanities paper, not something I often do, but I was interested in this one. It examined over 140,000 news headlines from major international news outlets from December 2019 to June 2020, and noted a preponderance of headlines in the negative sentiment category. And the key theme, the key words were words like pandemic, Trump featured in a major way, outbreak and virus. And the word fear featured prominently as a fear of death. But less so, interestingly, was the key symptom of COVID, that of breathlessness. And having just finished a big project on the experience of breathlessness, I was very interested to find that breath and breathlessness don't really feature very much in our discussion of this. And from the medical, interestingly, from the medical humanities perspective, the idea of breath as a critical function for life and as a metaphor for our times, I think has been central during this period of the pandemic, but it had been actually quite central, but not talked about clinically terribly much. It's been signaling the way in which we as humans are united, but how we were also different. At the outset of the pandemic, people comforted themselves with a sense of solidarity and a feeling that we're all in this together. But this seemed collapsed as it became clear that the virus was killing more people from BAME communities, areas of lower socioeconomic disadvantage. And these COVID-oriented concerns clearly gained metaphorical force at the time of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we all know about the I can't breathe outbreak from George Floyd and also Eric Garner, which became the rallying cry for that movement. So these connected themes of breath, of suffocation, allied to the notion of post-colonial oppression, silencing, inequality. They've all come together during the period of the pandemic, crossing clinical, scholarly, and public discourse, which is really the sense of where we are at as people in medical humanities. And they've stimulated significant calls across these fields for change, for pathways to a new, more equal and caring future. And I think I've really been stimulated and inspired by the work of Michael Marmot in his report, Build Back Fairer, the COVID-19 Marmot Review, because he proposes a way forward in detail, immediate actions, medium-term actions, longer-term actions, to try to address these searing health inequalities that have been emphasized by the epidemic, but have always been there. They've just been brought out in our understanding. He emphasizes it's not choices, it's not their choices that make people living in disadvantage have poor health, but it's the context within which they live that stimulate those choices. So it's a turnaround of the way we've been thinking of public health. And within the academy, the call for decolonizing the curriculum has become louder, and more attention has been paid by the global north to scholars with authoritative voices from the south. One such that has really, I find very stimulating to read, has been the Cameroon philosopher and theorist Akil Mbembe, who summarizes this mood really accurately in his essay, which he called The Universal Right to Breathe. And he catches this sense, which is in the Marmot report, of a need not just to return to normal, but to shape a new normal. And in his essay, he concludes by saying this: before this virus, humanity was already threatened with suffocation. If war there must be, it cannot so much be against a specific virus as against everything that condemns the majority of humankind to a premature cessation of breathing. Everything that fundamentally attacks the respiratory tract, everything that, in the long reign of capitalism, has constrained entire segments of the world population, entire races, to a difficult, panting breath and life of oppression. To come through this constriction would mean that we conceive of breathing beyond its purely biological aspect, and instead as that which we hold in common, that which by definition eludes all calculation, by which I mean the universal right to breath. So these entanglements between social views, often led by and reflected in the media, clinical response and scholarly interpretation, are apparent in the comparisons between the COVID epidemic and historical flu outbreaks. And Aditi has made mention of this historical contextualization. And again, this trajectory, though over time and now, has been a continually shifting one. I know in early February 2020, the US edition of the magazine Wired, which discusses future science, culture, and technology, cautioned against the notion that the flu is a bigger threat to the US than COVID. And this view was actually prevalent at that time, before COVID really took hold, and then was kind of dashed by people saying we need to start to abandon this myth. But I know now, just with the Prime Minister here in the UK the other day saying we're looking to think about actually COVID as being a bit more like flu in the future. So there's an interesting kind of reach back. So we tended to reach back to the past to help us understand our future. And this has not always been helpful, but it is understandable as it's aligned the frightening unknown, like COVID, with something familiar and potentially more predictable. There's a trend now to use previous pandemics to imagine us looking back from a future when the pandemic is over. Previous pandemics, like flu, are of course previous. They're in the past. They ended, and it's reassuring to know that it will happen with COVID, we hope. But the focus here is on remembering, and Jonathan Friedland wrote in The Guardian last month, asked about how will we remember COVID, and Aditi raised this issue. The history of previous pandemics suggests we'll not, and he asks the question, why? He suggests that we think about Graham Swift's conception of man as the storytelling animal. Wars offer a compelling story, hence the memorializing, but a pandemic lacks those crucial ingredients. There are no clear heroes and villains with intent and motive. As Friedland says, a mass illness does not invite that kind of remembering. The bereaved cannot console themselves that the dead made a sacrifice for some higher cause, or even that they were victims of an epic moral event, because they did not and were not. To die of the Spanish flu or COVID-19 is to have suffered the most terrible bad luck. So we're living this in real time, and the culture of COVID is being produced and reproduced a lot across these entangled sites of understanding and interpretation. And it remains to be seen whether we're going to remember COVID or whether the problems it's revealed, including these stark health inequalities, can be addressed more effectively in the future. And I was very struck in a more theoretical way that there's a wonderful article by Vincent Adams in 2009 suggested that a defining quality of our current moment is its characteristic sense of anticipation, of thinking and living towards the future. That in our time, the truth about the future can be known by way of the speculative forecast. We've been thinking a lot about modeling. How do we know what's going to happen as a result of this modeling work? And this really seems very true of the present moment. As people living through this time, we're continually straining towards a future without COVID, with continually fluctuating degrees of hope. As we're encouraged to address our mental health issues by living more effectively in the moment, we're always seeking reassurance that there is a future beyond this one that will be better, that will be safer, that will enable us to return to the things we did before, meet family and friends, go out for meals and to the cinema, work, develop our businesses. As NHS workers, not be in continual fear of having to face death in such large numbers, we want to be able to lose the fear. And Adams argues that anticipation pervades the ways we think about, feel, and address our contemporary problems, and that the present is governed at almost every scale as if the future is what matters most. And I think this is certainly true of our approaches to health generally, and this present crisis in particular. In the UK, we've been told to act now to avoid later overwhelming of health services. We watch infection rates climb, knowing that hospital admission rates will follow with a later death rate increase. And it's difficult in society that's been so used to instant gratification to be continually looking at this. And Adams describes a number of valences of anticipation, one of which she calls abduction, a means of determining courses of action in the face of ongoing contingency and ambiguity. Ideas about what to do are often generated by means of what I've been talking about here, tacking backwards and forwards between past, present, and future. Anticipation is also characterized by a sense of possibility, that everything will be all right as long as we anticipate properly. And I think now in the UK, in this third lockdown that we're in at the moment, our experience is overwhelmed by a lack of possibility. A lack of possibility in the economy, a lack of possibility in schooling in particular communities. The struggles of our students, as Aditi has very movingly mentioned, and not to mention the devastating effect of this pandemic on people's well-being and sense of purpose. So what might be needed is a revolution in the sense of possibility, which might require us to think about a change of direction, particularly in educational endeavors, preparing people from the interdisciplinary and connected world, and particularly in this case of health and thinking about these health inequalities. Now, Aditi has talked about the SHAPE initiative, but how might medical humanities connect here? And it seems to me really important that we come back to this notion that, to my mind, in the field of healthcare, the interdisciplinary work that we as people in medical humanities do, its time has really come. The Academy of Medical Sciences have this marvelous report, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, The Health of the Public by 2040, which looks at approaches to public health improvement and explicitly calls for transdisciplinary research including the arts and humanities, because of the breadth and complexity of public health drivers that Marmot talks about, such as social and cultural, environmental and health inequality drivers. But this report also recognises that we don't have a research workforce fit for purpose, or indeed a health workforce that are capable of working across these different disciplinary boundaries. It calls, this report, for capacity building of researchers who are skilled in this work, something we in medical humanities need to take on and drive. But there's also a wider responsibility, I think, to bear in mind the ways in which our culture is shaped by this entanglement of past, present, and anticipated future. We in the humanities who feel passionate about health, even through periods of despondency and lack of hope, need to support, I think, an act of collective remembering and those glimpses of a fairer new future we all wanted at the outset as we began to see the devastating effects of this pandemic. And we need to take responsibility for delivering it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jane. Hard not to come in with my own thoughts, but I shall keep those to myself at the moment. I'm going to invite Aditi and Jane just to, are there points you would like to pick up on in relation to each other's opening remarks?
I wondered, yes, just really kind of, I know you can't say much about the British Academy report, Aditi, but in terms of the initiative, the SHAPE initiative, can you say anything about how that came about? Was there a sense that the humanities weren't actually kind of being heard in relation to this pandemic? That there was a sense of that really the only voices that mattered were the scientists in this. Was there a kind of, was that why it started, or was there something else going on in terms of stimulating that initiative?
I can unmute myself. I thought I couldn't, right? To some extent, yes, Jane. The point was, it seemed like it was a medical solution we were looking for, or a political solution we were looking for. And or perhaps even in this, so far social sciences was concerned, an economic solution. But the fact that it is not just one kind of solution that is going to solve the issues was very much in the back of our minds. But to remind everybody that how much the humanities and social sciences together had to contribute, and what all the areas were that have not been touched upon or even thought of, like communication, for an example, the words of communication and so on, or even to think about the kind of discourse that you should have or should not have, certain kinds of stigma in terms of usage and so on. So the revitalizing the societal well-being was rather important, but it's reminded me that there were problems that were always there and have been there, that the COVID-19 has basically brought forward. So the issues of poverty, the issues of mental health, the issues of vulnerability, all of those were being more enhanced, and to bring that forward was rather important, and to put it together was very important for us. It was important to get everyone talking about the same thing in the same place, and exchanging ideas at the same time, without just being isolated little pots of areas that were being discussed. And that was one of the main reasons that
That seemed really important, because the other thing that struck me, and you just mentioned it again there, was just the issue of communication, which, because at the outset of the pandemic, working with one of my PhD students whose PhD was kind of thrown down because it was all about touch and in the hospice movement, and so of course you couldn't do that. So we started a project on mask wearing. And what was really interesting about, of course, it came out with the whole issue about how do you communicate with people with communication problems, and how is this changing the ways in which people interact within a clinical space? How does it change the way people feel about themselves? But it also, I think, it became sort of very clear that the acceptability of mask wearing was shifting very, very quickly. You know, again, we were trying to capture a moment in time, but that kind of moment in time kept changing almost by week on week. You know, this real sense of the speeding up of what's happening has been a feature, I think, of this fast forward kind of experience that we've all been having, which I think is also exhausting, as well as in some ways exhilarating, perhaps. But also, I think your point about communication, clearly, I think the whole problem of BAME communities and the uptake of vaccines, and people suddenly realizing, well, okay, but people trust their own people to deliver and explain this in their own language, and we didn't take that on board quickly enough, which is crazy, actually. But I think if there were more people from your kind of background and in terms of disciplinary expertise with that kind of cultural understanding, then we wouldn't make those same mistakes, I think. So I think it demonstrates that it's terribly important that people from our fields are involved in these levels. Yeah, and it's great the British Academy have taken that on board very much.
Yes, and the notion that, for example, sign language, which people simply forgot, that the medium of sign language is to a large extent seeing your face as well as the gesture,
Exactly.
touching your face, etc. So, where are you with that then? It just
exactly.
And another problem was the notion of translation versus communication is very important. You don't just a literal translation by using a translation program is not good enough, because the way you translate to a particular society is not the same, and it's going to be very different in the way you the interpretation of what you can say in a very complex sentence depends on your grasp of the knowledge of that language.
But I think the biggest concern I have, I think, just thinking about this and going over some of the kind of early thoughts that people had, this just remembering back to the very first lockdown that we experienced in the UK, I think is just that, I'd be interested, I think, in the audience views on this. We did have that sense of kind of things are different now. Things are different in ways that actually are good. There's less pollution. People are living lives that are perhaps calmer, less rushing about, more time to appreciate the slower things of life. And then the whole emergence of the drastic inequalities, the highlighting of all that. But I just do wonder whether, as the year has gone on, we have become too fatigued to think about striving to make that happen, rather than just let things revert back to the way they were, because we're too tired. We don't have the kind of space and the energy to try to confront and move things in the way that we were inspired to think about in the early stages of this. I wonder whether people feel that might be the case. I mean, there's a lot of questions coming into the chat, but that's one of my fears about the future here. And what is it that we can do from our perspective in the small areas in which we work to try to make that not happen?
So I might intervene here. I'm going to slightly bring in some of the questions from the floor as well as some thoughts on that. So one of the things Tom Rosenthal, who's our first person to put a question up, put up was that about the interactions in interpreting what's going on, because there's not only been the pandemic, there's also been Brexit, and that's going to have a big impact on things like economy and how we come out of that. You've mentioned climate change between you, and I would add that all the masks with microfiber we're using are not a great thing for climate change and pollution, and there seems to be very little discussion of that. But also there's been Black Lives Matters in this movement, and so there's going to be an awful lot of things going on at the same time, which is going to produce, it strikes me, and I'd be interested in your opinions, a kind of flurry of different ways of viewing this, and therefore how we come out of it. Who will be the villain? I think you said there are no villains, but you could look at, for example, Bergamont versus Verona and say that the right wing who wouldn't wear their masks had worse COVID than Verona who would, who are for a left-wing council. And similarly, the bigger, more authoritarian states seem to be doing worse with their macho men saying they're not wearing masks before catching COVID, have been a real issue. So I'm not sure there are no villains, and I think different villains will pop up with different mythologies. And I was wondering what Jane and Aditi could add to that. Maybe over to Aditi. Jane's looking like she's had a bit of a run out of words there. What do you think? So
in terms of having different villains, well, I was looking back at the past again and thinking that someone commented on the chat that a war, you have a hope that it will end and we'll go back to normality. But in the middle of the war, I mean, fortunately, you know, our parents and grandparents have had experience of the big, great wars, but a small war that I faced was the Bangladesh war. And you don't know that it's going to end. You have no idea when it is going to end. Perhaps with the pandemic, we had some hope that you know, the vaccine is going to bring some relief, and it might end. So when you're in the middle of it, you don't. But at the end of it, yes, you're right. I mean, there will be, perhaps there are enemies, but there are also the exhaustion at the end of it. Can you come up with what Jane pointed out? But that may actually lead to some novel ideas, and this might be exactly the time when this is the time to go back to those areas, of vulnerable areas that we have tended to look over and forget that they might be brought to the forefront with more energy and more interest. And I think that may not be such a bad thing after all, that there might be a revitalizing of areas that we have been ignoring and living on because life was just great and, you know, going on with it. This shock might actually lead to some radical changes. At least that's what I'm hoping for. Hope is always there.
I certainly agree with that. I mean, I think, yeah, sorry, Bridget, for looking a bit blank for a bit, but I was thinking, I think the key thing is just, I suppose, and Aditi and I have both kind of raised this question of remembering. Why is remembering important? Because people don't remember these pre-pandemics. They're not memorialized in the ways that wars are. And why is that? Is it because we want to forget? You know, and we don't. But there's plenty of people we've lost that we want to remember. So why is that different from wars? And why is it important to remember? Well, it's important to remember because if we remember, then we might make things different and better in the future. And that seems to me to be kind of really important. And I worry that we're going to forget that sense of kind of hope that we had at the outset, that sense of, no, we can't go back to this the way it was, because that's not good enough. And that very, very quickly kind of shifted in terms of the air pollution issue. You know, there was this attempt, I think, I don't know whether it's still going on, to try to improve, you know, context for people to cycle around the cities. And I'm not sure whether those increased cycle lanes are continuing or not, but there was a big shift at that point. And I don't know whether that initiative has continued.
It's true that the war, we sort of, you know, have memorials for that, but we also forget the loss of those generations of people who went through and lost their education, let's put it this way. That was not remembered. I think the generations after that forgot that had happened. So in that sense, I think that's the same. But I mean, war, of course, a big crisis like the oil crisis, I think is very different from pandemic, but it changed the way we thought about energy. And trying to use cars in a different way and so on and so forth. So big effect on America, where the big cars suddenly became not automatic cars, but shift cars. Suddenly people started learning how to have shift driving. I was a graduate student then, and I knew how to drive a shift car, but no one else did around me. Things there can be good things coming out of a crisis. I mean, after all, the war changed things for women drastically. You know, in the workforce, couldn't go back to that. NHS and so on and so forth. So, but what is different in this particular one, and coming up with the notion of other things taking into account, like the Brexit and so on, those factors eh, um, for are going to be very much there and very much play a role in the choices we make, because there has to be funding available for the kinds of things we want. And if the funding is moved away and the focus is moved away from trying to deal with the problems after Brexit, then we will lose out on that. And we have to make sure that we don't. If we have to we have to not lose faith, and I think we must keep on repeating what we believe in, and making sure that the people who are going to make the decisions are going to hear us.
Yes, I think that's right. So there's a number of comments, and it's really quite difficult to decide who to go into. So if I'm not using your questions, do forgive me. I'm going to turn a bit to what Zoe Playden's saying about history here. She's talking about C.P. Snow's 1959 volume on Two Cultures, and how the humanities were a clog in scientific progress. And 76, we had the pile of bricks at the Tate. I'm reading here, this is not from my knowledge base necessarily. And an alt-right attack on the arts and humanities is irrelevant, self-indulgent and elitist. Then we produced a national curriculum in the late 80s with a growing vocalization of secondary education, and then Manpower Services Commission was created. And what Zoe's saying is that this felt sometimes and still feels like a neo-colonial positioning of the arts and humanities, and with the humanities as a sort of other to science and technology. So it would be nice to think that these broad branches of knowledge would be interdependent, equal, and mutually inclusive, but she's asking how you would envisage such a decolonization. And I would say that, I'm just going to add my own little bit on the end here, forgive me, Zoe, is that in a way this is like the parity of how we treat mental health and physical health has this very similar imbalance of what's taken seriously and considered serious and what isn't. And I think that's a real factor within particularly economic discourses of how we position these two spheres, or these different two spheres that we're discussing. I don't know, I mean, in shape, you must have discussed some of this, I imagine.
Yes, in fact, all my academic life, I've been trying to fight the interdisciplinary nature of the work, and I agree that humanities, for when funding is tight, humanities subjects go first. Let's not teach any languages, because that just is a waste of time. We can just use DeepL to translate everything, or use an automatic speech recognition system, or whatever. But the fact that you cannot do without humanities. The fact that just speaking about language, which is my topic, is like you can't be human without the language. And it is going to change, and it is affecting your brain, and it's very much part of there. You can treat an aphasic patient with surgery and so on and so forth, perhaps, but to get the language back, you've got to go back to the humanities again. So it is true that unfortunately, the divide starts not in higher education, but the divide starts very much in school, as has been pointed out as well. And parents would encourage, particularly BME parents, I think, that don't go to study humanities. You will not get anywhere. Study STEM subjects. You will make a life for yourself. And that is fundamentally the wrong way to go about it. I mean, it used to be the case that in our grandparents' time that you could study maths and history together, but and Oxford to some extent you can, but not everywhere. It's not encouraged. If you do a Bachelor of Science, you do a Bachelor of Science. If you do a BA, you do a BA. And again, in our grant funding agencies, we see the divide as well. It is you have to do an AHRC grant or an ESRC grant or a BBSRC grant. It's all nicely cubicled, which is a great, great pity. And that does not have to be that way, because it isn't so in many other countries, even in European countries. So it could be different, and it could.
So Zoe's saying, how would you decolonize it? How can we set about that as a plan of action?
How is to keep on talking to the policymakers and being part of the research culture, and being when you're talking about the future and research and how to go after Brexit, how to change your research funding, to keep on articulating the fact that do not modularize them, make the fact that it can be interdisciplinary. In fact, it is interdisciplinary, and cross-cultural, across disciplines is the norm rather than the exception. And that's the only way I can think of.
Yeah. And I would add to that the need to change. I mean, as I mentioned in my few words, the need to change the way we think about education, because I think as the kind of rot sets in at school level, as a product of the Scottish educational system, and my first degree at a Scottish university, where as an arts graduate at that point, I was able to study across the disciplines, which was a better kind of way of doing things, I think. But I think there's an opportunity, as I was saying, that we've got a potential, I think, to think about developing at least some element of courses for people doing unidisciplinary subjects at university, to think about getting together to kind of, for example, address some of the big societal questions of the day, such as climate change, such as health inequalities, by getting together in a module we might design that sort of says, okay, let's get people from physics, from geography, geology, from modeling, from history, from literature, to get together to kind of think about this thing from their different disciplinary perspectives, and get that sense of what is it like to work together on a problem with the kind of knowledge and skills that I've got from my disciplinary perspective. And I think we need to do that as educationalists, of course as well. We need to do that in the research perspective. And I think we're pushing on an open door. I think a lot of the funders are saying, yeah, we want people to be working cross-disciplinary. We want to bring the arts and humanities in to addressing some of these big questions. There's quite a lot of lip service paid to that. It's our responsibility as leaders in this academic field to go knocking on doors and saying, can I get involved in this debate, please? Can I be involved in thinking about developing your research policies here? Of course, I think going back to Zoe's point, there is a danger, of course, that what we don't want to find ourselves doing, particularly in the field of medical humanities, and I can see there's a danger, to justify the arts and humanities through its application to health. And I think we want to avoid that. Okay, it'd be great to have our humanities colleagues working with us on problems of health, but I think what health themes also do they can bring alive questions for the humanities as well. So there's a two-way street here that, you know, we start to develop new themes, cognitive humanities, ideas that will start to stimulate new ways of thinking about literary studies or historical studies that come from a consideration of questions of health, of questions of the environment. So it's about the discipline coming alive, not just what the discipline can do for the problem. So we've got that, I think, working together.
I was really struck in that respect, Jane, with your, and forgive me, I forget who you were quoting, who was talking about a transdisciplinary approach rather than an interdisciplinary approach, which I think I have always found very compelling, the difference between the inter and the transdisciplinary, in the sense of I was really struck with your description of capacity building, and I guess what's kind of embedded in that perhaps is this idea that we, as you say, change direction. What kind of new knowledge can we form that isn't about disciplines sort of sitting in their own silos and sort of collaborating in between space, but actually striving for something different? Clearly, a change of direction here is what we urgently need for the future, isn't it?
I agree with that. The transdisciplinary was talked about in the Academy of Medical Sciences report, which was the the health of the public by 2040, very future orientated, which came out of a number of discussions and meetings. But again, the point I've just made, and I've recently been trying to reconnect with the Academy a bit on this, because when you look at those who were involved in putting that report together, despite the fact that on a number of occasions during the course of writing that report, they call upon the importance of engaging with arts and humanities, nobody from our field was involved in compiling that report. Now that's where we need to start to shift things, because if we're not in the conversation, we can't continue to have conversations in our own silos. We have to get into the spaces where these conversations are taking place and being able to start to influence them, I think, at these policy levels. Now, I'm the first to admit I've got lots of experience in doing this kind of thing, but I'm trying now to think about how to do it, to kind of get in there, because otherwise we'll never influence the kind of wider agenda, I think, and we're going to try and do that.
Aditi, I don't know if you had anything to add at that point. I was quite struck here by the fact that I was very irritated by this in relation to the gender pay gap report, and they had a BMA meeting about this in relation, and they just seem to not have any idea about feminist theory, about gender pay gaps in other areas, about different roles for women in work, and how that all played out within the gender pay gap in medicine. And it was so arrogant. I was furious.
I can imagine you were furious. Yes, I'm afraid I don't know much about. It shouldn't be that. That's what I would say to begin with. And it sounds like an archaic thing to have at this day and age, but unfortunately, it still exists.
Yeah.
And so the only thing again to do is probably to ensure that if we are in charge of hiring, to ensure that this is not going to occur.
And I think that's what Zoe's talking about with colonization. It's like this arrogance of assuming of everything you know about is all there is, as opposed to seeking out in an interdisciplinary knowledge.
Yes, and Zoe's point about the philosophy suddenly becoming fashionable, with ethics and AI being part of it and being able to model and it's sort of similar to the linguist becoming fashionable when speech recognition technologies and companies are tending to ask linguists perhaps something about the language and not treating it as exactly like an engineering problem alone. But it is unfortunately seems to be only come to the mind of people when there is a gap in the knowledge, or they recognize that there is a gap in the knowledge. It's the recognition of that which we have to ensure that they have for all the disciplines, not just one or two, and accidentally.
But I think also it brings out a key characteristic, I think, of the interdisciplinary researcher, which is humility.
Yes.
And humility is not, in my experience as a clinician, something that a lot of clinicians have in large amounts. So I think, and this is a very interesting, I mean, I know lots of friends of mine who work as clinicians, and so I don't want to kind of dish people, but there is an interesting thing when you get into these interesting discussions about this kind of management of the different paradigms of discussion, because there can be a problem on the one hand. The scientific clinical knowledge can be very dominating because of its certainties, and it can shout quite loudly in these spaces, whereas those of us, I'm us in both cases, work in the arts and humanities, we hold possibilities in our hand, and we shift around those possibilities. They're all live. They all have potential to be true. Whereas in the clinical thing, and there's a necessity here. We've got to act in the clinic. We've got to sort of say, well, this is the thing we're going to act on. This is the route we're going to take. Whereas in the humanities, we've got the privilege of saying, well, this could be this thing, and we can do this thing, and this could be possible. And so there's a real challenge with this interpretive way of thinking and this kind of scientific way of thinking. And I think the way to go about it is to be very open, and to be very aware of what you don't know and don't understand, and to seek that from the people with whom you're working. And when so often I begun to work with people from clinical specialists. One of the fantastic things about the people in those fields is that they're often tremendously good about talking about what they know, and so they can explain it. They can outline it very well to us, and it's that's one of the joys of interdisciplinary working, actually, bringing people in who can talk about their expertise, but also the important thing is to listen to other people's expertise and to be able to start to think, how can we bring these ideas together? How can we ask new questions that are going to be different from the ones we've asked before, and aren't necessarily the ones we ask up front, close to the coalface of clinical medicine.
Can I add to your, or rather comment on your word scientific way of thinking? I think the humanities also have a scientific way of thinking. It's only in English that you make this difference between scientific and humanities. If you were speaking German, you would say Wissenschaft, or in Dutch, Wetenschap, which essentially would mean, so Wissenschaft could be easily language, Sprachwissenschaft, or it could be physics, or it could be anything. Everything is Wissenschaft, knowledge, essentially. And the analytic thinking goes for all the disciplines. It's not just the one way of particularly of thinking. And this is unfortunately not grasped, and the language, the terminology, let's put it this way, is not helping either. And that goes for the use of language, unfortunately.
Could I bring in a couple of comments from the chat, which I think work alongside each other, and maybe speak a little bit to this idea of change of direction and perhaps also capacity building in its own way. So Catherine writes, given the mass trauma of the pandemic and its short and long-term mental health impacts, I'm hopeful that some of the stigmatization around mental health issues will be reduced post-pandemic. And Tamar comments, I have similar hope about long COVID. Hopefully it will contribute to improved acceptability of chronic fatigue syndrome and other functional neurological conditions. I don't know if that prompts any thoughts in either of you, but I'm just thinking there about the kind of possible shifts around the ways that we've understood the divisions between mental and physical health.
Yeah, I'm very interested by the long COVID issue. Actually, I've got a PhD student at the moment who is looking at so-called persistent physical symptoms, and she's caught onto this discussion, and her she's a literary scholar, but she's doing some interviews with people who suffer from persistent physical symptoms and ME and other conditions of that sort. And what she's found actually from that group is quite a profound resentment about the kind of way in which long COVID has caught the imagination of people and has suddenly stimulated, clinics and treatments and attention and, legitimization in a way that some of these other so-called functional disorders have not, and that something that could be called long COVID after a few months, which is so different from some people who've been suffering some of these conditions for a decade or whatever. So I think we have to be very sensitive that it's not necessarily a positive thing, these kinds of comparisons, that they can be quite difficult for people who have been in this situation for a long, long time. And I've not got any particular clear senses about the kind of mental health impact. I mean, I think, of course, there is a sense that people have been talking about, well, we're going to be having a kind of pandemic of mental health problems following on from this pandemic. But I think I read again, I think it was, I think you got all my information from The Guardian, but not necessarily the case, but there was a prominent clinical psychologist was writing and saying, actually, if you look at it in detail, I mean, people obviously are feeling sad, they're feeling scared, they're feeling nervous, they're feeling frightened, but it isn't necessarily a mental health problem. And we tend to bandy that expression around a lot in a way that, these are normal human responses to difficult situations. And it isn't necessarily the case that it's going to lead to a very kind of a terrible outbreak of mental health problems. Those who have mental health problems, I think it's definitely been made worse by these circumstances. And that is a real terrible thing and a tragedy and something we're going to have to deal with. But I think Aditi might want to comment on some of the language being used here again, as to how it could be damaging, and also not helpful sometimes.
But also the fact that I agree, but perhaps the taboo against it may definitely the health problems will probably be more acknowledged. But the fact is, it may not just be increasing, it may be the fact that it is coming to the fore, that it is already there, but it is this particular COVID trauma it's same with the children. The studies that have come out is exactly the same. But it's the question is that another aspect of this has revealed is that we automatically assume working at home, working in this medium, is, well, just work at home, just use the computer. The fact is, this can be very debilitating for some people, and that effect of it is simply been ignored. That talking to a machine is not easy for many people, and that is coming across in interviews, for example. People are failing because they are not good at talking to a computer rather than face-to-face issues. What one can hope for is that the underlying problems that already exist, and that was I was saying in the beginning, perhaps will become more recognized, and the funding, the resources that could be given in that direction, hopefully will be given and not brushed under the carpet all over again. But to make sure that doesn't happen, we have to keep reminding the policymakers.
I might just change the subject quite a bit, because we've got a different bit of questions coming in. We've got a quarter of an hour still to run. Alex Mamikides has mentioned that there's quite an entanglement between kind of health practices and what we're expected to do in the home, and wondering how this impacts on private life. Jennifer was commenting that actually some people do medicalize already their homes in terms of having OCD, particularly for hygiene. And this whole thing about moving over to act as though you've got it. So the blurring of the lines between being sick and being well can be quite confounding, I think. So there's a kind of whole shifting of boundaries, and I think the boundary of the computer and another person is also another difficulty boundary that are new within what we're talking about. I don't know what you think about that, Aditi.
I thought Joe had a comment. Oops, sorry, yes, I thought I was muted. Joe had a comment about this, which was far more enlightening than what I would perhaps be able to say.
Over to Joe, yeah.
I think I was following up on Alex's comment because it's a reference to Susan Sontag's book Illness as Metaphor, and in the preface to that, Sontag talks about the two kingdoms that we have dual citizenship of. We don't like to admit that we have a passport to the kingdom of the sick, and that kind of works its way through our sort of our sort of intimate metaphors that we use in everyday life, but it also we use it in cultural terms too, that the kind of metaphors around illness get played out in cultural discourses too. And I guess it seems to me, in terms of what Alex was saying in the chat, that there is there's a possibility of remaking ideas of citizenship, perhaps more honest acknowledgement of our sort of cohabitation in both those places. I was kind of extending that kind of idea from Sontag through Alex's comments. But I guess I don't want to colonize. The thing that occurs to me in the word citizenship is a word that I've been wondering about as we've been talking this evening, which maybe I'll ask Jane and Aditi what they think of, which is dependency. Whether in terms of thinking about the future and living through, I mean, this question about how we remember COVID, could it be that one of the ways we remember it is that it actually has made very visible to us our dependencies upon each other and our vulnerabilities to each other. So maybe not memorializing in the way that we memorialize those that are lost to war, but maybe shifting mindset, particularly in a neoliberal context, that remembers that collectivity and citizenship is important, not just individuality.
Yes, and one thing.
Sorry, forgive me. I shouldn't. Go ahead, Aditi. Yeah.
You go ahead first, and then.
Oh, quite. Well, I think that's a lovely point, Joe, and it kind of swirls around other major issues that have made me incandescent with rage at times during the course of this pandemic, particularly the kind of the test and trace system, which I'm sure a lot of us share the view about. I kept sort of shaking my fist at the government on the TV, sort of insisting on doing it that way. We're thinking, well, hang on a minute, we've got this fantastic network of general practices all around the country that know a lot about their patients. Why the hell are we not using them? Well, because the public health structures that we had before austerity have been decimated, and now we see what can be achieved when you look at that. And indeed, as Aditi was saying earlier, what can be achieved when we use local knowledge to help support local people. Now, this has been one of the great kind of glories, particularly in the outset of this, and it's still here in my little close here in Durham. We at the outset formed a WhatsApp group, and one of our neighbors brings a coffee van in every Thursday morning, and everyone goes out and has coffee in the street. And everyone's supporting everybody, sharing things around the neighborhood in a way that never happened before. And there is a sense of reliance on everybody else. There's a sense that as people here locally we can go to for help, for minor things but bigger things. And that is a kind of a society, I think, which we all kind of at the outset thought, we want more of this. We want society to be more like this. So how do we hang on to that and try to make a virtue of it? Indeed, think about how perhaps some of our young people who've lost their jobs in retail and in hospitality might perhaps start to do more that would help to build a society that's more like that, to have roles in that way. That's the kind of thing I think we're all wanting to see happen.
I was just going to comment on the fact, Jane, I mean, you're absolutely right, that it was quite clear that certain communities where isolation was leading to mental health issues were relating to people living alone, and in cultures where joint families live together, you had less of an isolation problem and less of that. Of course, there was a different problem, namely a problem of being too close to each other, and thereby having problems the other way around. But at least the isolation problem was not there. Another thing that was striking that I didn't mention was that for infants and babies, where language input is extremely important to acquire a proper language system, were getting very little input because they were only getting input from maybe one parent, or sometimes just one, or sometimes maximally two, and not the social environment which they require to acquire language, not learn language, but acquire language. So all of these were coming out, all of these problems and issues, which are inherently in certain cultures. So certain cultures were suffering more than others, and these problems appear and become more evident because of the pandemic. And the hope is that, that's one of the things we mentioned in the document, is that from this we can learn, or the policymakers should take into account, that the problem is there, but the manifestation of it has become more obvious during the COVID period.
So we've got 8 minutes left. I've been ignoring the discussion about war versus pandemic and its impact, but there's been quite a lot of discussion on why is it different? Why is it differently experienced? Why is it differently celebrated or remembered, depending on how you look at it, and how its narrative differs? Like Aditi, I think that the idea that during a war you have an idea of its end, I think that's probably false, because when you're in the middle of it, you don't have an idea of it. You feel like it may go on forever, and you have a fear that it might. So there's some discussions about how war changes things. I think one of the things about war, which we're not getting with the pandemic, is that with physical destruction of property, and therefore infrastructure, you get mass migration of people and people coming together as well as being held apart. Whereas with the pandemic, it's almost entirely been keeping people apart. But that doesn't address any of the issues around memory and literatures. I don't know, any thoughts on that? Because we've had quite a lot of it in the chat room.
I mean, Alex's point about the heroes being the frontline workers, the NHS and the PPE, and indeed they are, and there are victims too. We do tend to, as Jane said, glorify war to some extent, forgetting the pain and the destruction to some extent. But the pandemic, one doesn't. One just is hopeful that it will go away. And that is where the history comes in. There are differences, of course, but those who have lost out, whether by death of a close one or by, educational loss, or worsening mental health and isolation and all sorts of things, I think, at least in this pandemic, let's hope that they will not be forgotten, and that memory should not go away.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting the way that Alex has done that as a sort of boundary crossing, because I think there's been also a bit of a narrative about, well, we're all heroes in this because we're all having to suffer, particular constraints to our freedom. We're all having to do things, and that has been mobilized for political reasons also, to make us feel proud about ourselves for achieving certain things to protect the NHS, to protect our families, to protect other people. So it's an interesting kind of set of connections here. And you know, I think the problem with the kind of the glorifying particular groups is that we tend to forget about the supermarket workers who have also kept us fed, and also the care home workers who have looked after our older people. So you know, I think the you know, the clap for carers, and the clap for the NHS and all the big signs about NHS heroes. I mean, it from my experience, having done some work in the NHS at that time, people felt very uncomfortable about it. I don't know about any other clinicians here, but most of my colleagues actually felt uncomfortable about being clapped because, well, they felt, for one thing, they were doing their job, but they felt there were a lot of other people who actually deserved the same kind of glory, if you like, as well. So it's an interesting one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've rung up an awful lot of patients over this period of time, and a certain number have chosen to thank me for my massive amounts of work in the area, which is so totally untrue because I've just done my normal job. And what I've been trying to do is to deflect the attention onto the healthcare workers and the cleaners on the wards and all these people who have suffered a disproportionate amount of the burden of this illness, and without the financial security of the most visible. And it's absolutely classic that doctors get all the praise, when in fact an awful lot of the hard work is done by the people who are not recognised as being there and being critical for the running of hospitals. Sorry, that's just an aside of my own ranting, forgive me. So I'm going to suggest that Jennifer takes over now, because we've got just 3 minutes to the end of the meeting, and I think she has some announcements to make, and so I'll hand over to her. Thank you.
Gosh, Bridget, I think I made most of my announcements at the beginning already. So I'm really wondering. I think this is a really fantastic discussion. It's I think you know, you can see that everybody is making all sorts of connections and having some of the things that we managed to do a bit of when we go to the pub and have our conversations with each other and think deeply about things that we've heard. And with our fantastic panel, it's really nice to see the chat becoming very, very lively as people start to think more more deeply about what we've been listening to tonight, which has been so very thought-provoking and really, you know, deeply interesting, and some of the things that we ourselves need to think more about at the AMH. Bridget, I'm just wondering, is there something that I've forgotten that you were thinking I was going to say?
Well, I would like to give the hugest thanks to our two speakers.
Thank you, Jo.
Jane.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. And I think the worst thing about being online is that we can't hail you with a big round of applause, but you can assume that people are clapping silently behind their mics. But thank you both so much. Really wonderful conversation.
Yes, thank you for both giving your time. It's really been
Thank you for asking us.
a fantastic evening.
It's really been a great pleasure. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Mm.
And I'd like to apologise to those whose questions I didn't manage to get round to. Forgive me. But thank you for asking them, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much for joining us, everybody, and I hope to see you next time as well.
We should perhaps just flag the date. Actually, there was a question in the chat about the date of Limerick, of the conference, which is 16th to 18th of June. And our next conversation will be with Professor Trish Greenhalgh and Professor Ludmila Jordanova, who I think is with us this evening, actually. And that's on the 25th of March, Thursday, the 25th of March. Same place.
Thank you again, Jane and Aditi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Aditi, I just wanted to say a little thing to you. Have you read the paper? There's some papers in epilepsy, which is my field, about the use of linguistics to diagnose between functional and non-functional epilepsy. which
Oh.
are incredibly useful. And
Great.
I think it's a really beautiful example of cross-disciplinarity.
Excellent. Yes, will do.
They're done by Marcus Ruber. They're excellent.
I'll ask you about them.
Okay, we'll email each other another time. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you, Joe.
Welcome.
Bye. Thank you, Bridget.
Shall we end the
Lovely
meeting?
to see everybody.